Imagine trying to plan the ultimate victory party.
Okay, I am with you. Like a massive celebration.
Right. But there is a huge catch. You are, absolutely convinced that to get to this party, you and everyone you love have to be violently overthrown
Oh,
first.
wow. Yeah, that really puts a damper on things.
I mean, you'd probably hold off on buying the balloons, right?
For sure. You wouldn't even send the invitations.
Yeah, that morbid psychological paralysis is just a terrifying thing to consider. How our assumptions about the future dictate our actions in the present. We are doing a deep dive into a specific text by the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards.
And it is a fascinating text.
It really is. He wrote this piece calling for, quote, extraordinary prayer for the revival of religion. But before he could even get anyone to pray, he had to deal with this massive issue.
Right, he had to dismantle a theological roadblock that was actively keeping people from praying for the advancement of Christ's kingdom.
Okay, let's unpack this. Lay out the primary objection Edwards is trying to dismantle here.
Well, it was a huge roadblock. The premise Edwards had to confront was held by many serious, dedicated believers in his time, and I mean, it was genuinely terrifying.
What were they so afraid of?
There was this prevailing belief that before the church could experience its greatest days of peace and spiritual flourishing, which they often referred to as the latter-day glory, it first had to go through its most terrible time of suffering.
So things had to get really, really bad before they got good.
Spot on. And this suffering was linked directly to a specific event described in the book of Revelation, chapter 11. They called it the slaying of the witnesses.
Let me just stop you right there to make sure we have our terms defined for this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us who, do not read apocalyptic literature every single day, what did they mean by the slaying of the witnesses?
Yeah, that is a great question.
What was the actual scenario they were dreading so much?
So people interpreted this passage to mean that the Church of Christ must be almost completely wiped off the face of the earth.
Wow. Literally wiped out.
Yeah. They believed a time of dreadful persecution was looming, a time where the vast majority of God's people would be killed by their enemies, the truth would be totally suppressed, and the visible church would essentially just cease to exist for a while.
That is incredibly bleak.
It is. The witnesses, which represents the faithful believers holding on to the truth, would lie dead in the streets, metaphorically speaking, while the enemies of the gospel celebrated their total victory.
So the idea was that Satan and the anti-Christian forces would obtain their absolute greatest victory over the church, bringing her lower than she had ever been in all of history.
Precisely.
And Edwards looks at this and realizes the massive psychological block it creates. I mean, if you believe the end of the world requires the near extinction of the church, how can you enthusiastically pray for it?
You really can't.
Right. It is like wishing for the weekend to arrive, but knowing that to get there, your house has to burn down on Friday. You want the final victory, you want the rest and the joy, but the dread of the slaughter completely dampens your enthusiasm.
What's fascinating here is how he maps out the logic of fear brilliantly. He points out that human nature instinctively shrinks from extreme suffering.
Which is totally normal. No one wants to suffer.
Exactly. So if believers pray for the glorious day to arrive speedily, they are essentially praying for the rapid approach of a dismal time.
They're asking God to bring on a season where they themselves, or maybe their kids, might die under extreme cruelties.
Yes. Edwards notes that even a renewed nature dreads seeing God's enemies travail. You just cannot earnestly pray for a massive global revival if you think the immediate consequence of that revival is the almost total eradication of true religion in the world.
He argues that this hypothesis will keep down joyful expectation. And I want to point this out to you, the listener. If you assume you will never live to see any dawning of the glorious day, but only the dismal slaughter that precedes it, your prayers will be hesitant.
You will be praying in a state of mourning, expecting to be slain. This notion just hinders earnest, animated prayer.
Think about your own community right now. If your theology tells you things must get catastrophically worse before Christ acts, your prayers for your city or your church are going to lack boldness.
Oh, completely.
You are essentially just praying for the bunker to hold up against the inevitable assault. You are not praying for a breakthrough. You are bracing for impact.
And that defensive posture is what Edwards recognized as a total tragedy. He says, it is 1,000 pities this opinion should be retained if there is no good ground for it.
So he takes it upon himself to tear it down.
He does. He decides to examine the foundation of this dread. He wants to prove that the slaying of the witnesses in Revelation 11 is not a future event hanging over their heads like a guillotine.
But something that has already happened.
Yes, something that has already been fulfilled in the past. But to build this case, he has to define what the quote-unquote death of the witnesses actually entails in reality.
Right. If people are terrified of this death, Edwards needs to show them what that death looks like historically.
The text says the witnesses lie dead in the streets of the great city. Edwards takes this symbolism and applies it to the state of the visible church.
And he argues this represents the absolute lowest possible state of the true church, right?
Spot on. It is a time of zero visibility, barbarous ignorance, the destruction of all monuments of truth, and no apparent means of recovery.
He lays out some strict rules for this, doesn't he?
He lays out a very strict set of criteria for what this death means. Before this slaying event, the text says the witnesses prophesy in sackcloth.
Let's clarify sackcloth as well. In biblical terms, that means a state of mourning or affliction, right? Like wearing rough, uncomfortable clothing to show distress.
Yes, precisely. They are kept low, they are persecuted, and they are mourning the state of the world. But here's the critical distinction Edwards makes.
Okay.
While they are in sackcloth, they still have life. They are still actively prophesying.
So they are beaten down, but they are not gone.
Right. The text even says they have the ability to bring plagues on their enemies, meaning there's enough true religion left to be a continual torment to the opposition.
Yeah.
The enemies are bothered by them.
But when the witnesses are actually dead, that dynamic changes completely.
It changes entirely.
Yeah.
The enemies rejoice, feast, and have a public triumph. They believe they have completely stamped out the truth.
So Edwards says this must be a time when the truth is furthest out of sight, most forgotten, with the fewest beams of light or traces of truth remaining.
It implies a time completely destitute of all public history and memory of true religion.
Now, I want to push back on this a bit. I look at our current cultural landscape, I see the rapid secularization of society. I see the church facing massive hostility. Couldn't things easily get worse?
I mean, a lot of people think so.
Society changes fast. It seems entirely plausible to a lot of people today that we could slide back into a dark age of persecution. We have the internet, sure, but we also have deepfakes, massive censorship capabilities, and ideological echo chambers.
That is very true.
Couldn't the erasure of truth happen digitally now? Why does Edwards find a regression to this absolute level of death to be next to impossible?
Well, that is a very fair modern application of the fear. But Edwards is drawing a firm line between cultural decline and total global eradication.
How so?
He says that for the church to return to the state described in the prophecy, which is a state worse than all times before the Reformation, it would require much more than just severe persecution or censorship.
So it is not just getting deplatformed or facing legal trouble.
No, the opposition wouldn't just have to win political victories or control the narrative. They would have to utterly wipe Protestantism from the face of the entire earth. Yes, globally. They would have to bury all light and truth in so deep an oblivion that no means of revival remain. Furthermore, Edwards notes that these opposing nations would have to completely metamorphose themselves.
Meaning they would have to induce a global generational amnesia?
Exactly.
They would literally have to unlearn everything, destroying all learning, study, and historical inquiry. So what does this all mean? It means you can burn books, you can ban websites, but you cannot easily unteach millions of people how to read.
Right.
Or erase the historical memory of centuries of theology without destroying civilization itself.
He actually uses the analogy of a universal deluge.
Like Noah's flood.
Yes. He says that to bring things to such a pass, you'd need another catastrophe on the scale of a universal deluge, where only a few ignorant, barbarous persons are preserved in an ark.
Persecution alone, without complete and utter annihilation of global knowledge, just wouldn't be sufficient.
The structural reality of the world changed. The printing press happened, the scriptures were translated into the common tongues and distributed across continents.
The truth is completely decentralized now.
It is.
So to get back to the absolute zero visibility of the Dark Ages would require a miraculous negative intervention, a literal wiping of the global slate.
Which is a comforting thought, honestly.
It really is. The logistical reality of the world makes that specific kind of death highly improbable. But Edwards doesn't just rely on logistics, does he?
No, he doesn't stop there.
Since a total regression is historically and practically unlikely, he turns to look at God's established historical track record. How does God typically handle rescues?
Well, Edwards views the historical Reformation in the days of figures like Luther and Calvin as the definitive beginning of the Antichrist's downfall.
That was a massive shift.
It was huge. He points out that this was not a small, localized event. The opposing system lost at least half its dominions, and its authority over what was left was severely diminished.
God, in answer to the cries of his people, awakened as one out of sleep and began to deliver his church from her incredibly low state.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Edwards establishes a theological rule based on how God operates.
What is the rule?
He states that God does not desert his people after beginning a deliverance. His work of salvation is perfect. When he causes the day of deliverance to dawn after a long night of dismal darkness, he will not extinguish the light and cause them to return again to midnight darkness.
He uses the imagery of the smoking flax from Isaiah, doesn't he?
He does. He will not enkindle a blessed fire only to quench it.
Think about a massive rescue operation at sea. Imagine a ship goes down in the freezing ocean at night. You are stranded in the water.
Terrifying scenario.
Absolutely. Finally, a rescue helicopter spots you. They hover overhead. They drop the lifeline down. The spotlight is right on your face. You grab the rope and they start pulling you up.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Edwards' argument is that God does not drop the lifeline, pull you halfway out of the freezing water, and then suddenly turn off the spotlight, cut the rope, and fly away.
Leaving you to plunge back into a worse state than before.
Right. Once the rescue begins, God sustains the effort until it is finished. To prove this, Edwards walks through several major biblical examples. Let's look at the first one, ancient Babylon.
Babylon is a crucial type for Edwards, as it is often referred to in the book of Revelation as a symbol of the anti-Christian system. The destruction of ancient Babylon was not a single overnight event.
It took a long time.
It was accomplished gradually, by various steps, over a great distance of time.
Right, it started with Cyrus the Great. He famously diverted the river Euphrates to march his army right under the massive, impenetrable walls of Babylon while the city was feasting.
Yes, that was the initial fatal blow, but Babylon still existed as a city after that.
It wasn't wiped off the map yet.
No. Then, about 18 years later, Darius brought a yet greater destruction upon them. But it was actually about 223 years after that, before the ruin was perfected.
That's a long process.
Eventually, Babylon became a perpetual desolation, a literal dwelling place for owls and dragons, completely uninhabited.
So what is the key takeaway there for Edwards?
The sustained nature of the judgment. Once God began to destroy Babylon, he went on until he finished. He never suffered Babylon to recover its strength and establish its former empire. The trajectory, once set, was permanent.
And the flip side of the destruction of Babylon is the restoration of the Jewish church after the Babylonian captivity. This was also a long, drawn-out process.
It happened by various steps across multiple generations. There were several times of return and distinct decrees from different Persian emperors to rebuild Jerusalem.
If you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you see how messy this rescue operation was.
Oh, it was incredibly messy. It was done in turbulent times.
They faced great interruptions, violent oppositions from figures like Sanballat and Tobiah. There were times where the enemy prevailed temporarily, halting the construction of the temple or the walls.
Nehemiah's men literally had to build the wall with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other.
It was not a frictionless process at all.
But that is the core of Edwards' argument. Despite the setbacks, despite the fierce opposition and the moments of discouragement, God never suffered the enemies to bring Jerusalem back to the state of total desolation it had been in before the restoration began.
The progress fluctuated, but the baseline moved permanently upward.
Exactly. Once the work started, God made an end of it.
He also looks at the intertestamental period, bringing up Antiochus Epiphanes. For those unfamiliar, Antiochus was a Hellenistic king who fiercely persecuted the Jews. He famously defiled the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing a pig on the altar.
He is a classic biblical type of the Antichrist.
How did God deal with him?
The deliverance of God's people from his oppression was also gradual. The people were first assisted a little by the Maccabees, who launched a guerrilla revolt.
Right, they fought back from the hills.
And the deliverance was eventually completed in the recovery of Jerusalem, the cleansing and restoration of the temple, and the miserable death of Antiochus himself.
So again, a sustained victory.
Edward stresses that after God appeared for the help of his church in that instance, even though the situation had seemed completely dead and past all hope, he never suffered Antiochus to prevail to that degree again.
The vast, powerful empire of Antiochus was engaged against a tiny handful of people, yet God sustained the deliverance.
The final historical example he gives is brilliant because it focuses on the psychology of the enemy.
Oh, I love this one. He looks at Haman from the Book of Esther. Haman was a proud, inveterate enemy of the Jews who plotted a state-sponsored genocide to wipe out the entire nation.
Edwards notes that when Haman began to fall before Esther and Mordecai, his ruin never stayed until it was complete. He quotes a fascinating observation from Haman's own wife, Zeresh.
Right, Haman comes home humiliated because the king forced him to parade Mordecai through the streets in honor. Haman is complaining to his wife and his friends.
And Zeresh looks at the situation and recognizes the divine pattern.
She basically tells him it is over.
She tells Haman that since Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, and Haman has begun to fall before him, Haman will not prevail, but will surely fall completely.
Even the pagan enemies recognize that once the tipping point of divine deliverance is reached, the momentum is irreversible. God's pattern is steadfast.
This established track record provides immense comfort. Edwards is assuring his readers that the Reformation was that historical tipping point for the modern church.
The destruction of the enemy's dominion has begun. The deliverance has started.
And therefore, based on the very character of God revealed in Scripture, we should not expect a sudden reversal that plunges the church back into total death. The helicopter has dropped the lifeline, the tension is on the rope, and God is pulling the church upward.
So if physical persecution isn't enough to wipe out the church anymore, and God's historical pattern proves he sustains his rescues, how do we know the math actually backs that up?
The math.
Yeah, because Edwards doesn't just look at history. He looks at the demographics embedded in the prophecy itself. This brings us to his argument about the two witnesses.
Oh, right. He makes a fascinating numerical argument about the specific text of Revelation 11. The passage explicitly calls them the two witnesses.
Why two? And how does Edwards use this number to prove the slaying is already in the past?
Edwards asks, why two? In biblical law, specifically in Deuteronomy, two witnesses were the absolute minimum required to establish a matter in a legal setting.
So it is the bare minimum.
Calling them two witnesses signifies a time when the visible defenders of the faith were exceedingly few. They were the bare minimum required to keep the truth alive on the earth.
He argues this description perfectly fits the dark centuries preceding the Reformation.
It really does. During that massive stretch of history, only a tiny, isolated remnant groups like the Waldensians or early figures like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus maintained the truth against overwhelming continent-wide opposition.
They were the two witnesses prophesying in sackcloth.
But contrast that with the landscape after the Reformation.
I want to highlight the contrast for you, the listener. Today, and even in Edwards' time, the visible church is vastly large.
Edwards points out that the visible Church of Christ became massive. In his own day, he notes that the number of Protestants was thought to be nearly equal to the number of Papists. The number of true saints was far greater than before.
Think about the scale of this. When you have millions of people spanning multiple nations, kingdoms, and continents confessing the truth, the metaphor of two witnesses completely breaks down.
It doesn't work anymore.
You cannot look at a massive, global, visible Protestant presence with universities, printing presses, and national churches and accurately describe it as two witnesses prophesying in sackcloth. Therefore, the two witnesses metaphor no longer fits the massive, visible reality of the post-Reformation church.
It is a brilliant argument from sheer scale. If the prophecy is restricted to a time of two, and we now have millions, the time of the two must be a historical era that has closed.
The period of extreme scarcity of truth has passed.
But this introduces a new problem. If the opposition cannot simply physically overwhelm this massive Protestant presence by sheer numbers or brute force anymore, they do not just give up.
They adapt.
They turn to political craftiness, subtle plots, and maneuvering. How does God defend his vast church against sophisticated political and cultural strategy?
Edwards turns to Revelation chapter 16, verse 10 to answer that right. He introduces the pouring out of the fifth vial of God's wrath.
Yes.
Wait, hold on. Fifth vial. Let's define our terms again for everyone. What exactly is a vial in this context, and who is the beast Edwards is referring to here?
In the symbolism of Revelation, a vial, or a bowl, represents a specific outpouring of God's judgment upon the earth. Edwards draws heavily on the exposition of a learned contemporary, Mr. Lohman, to interpret this specific fifth vial as a prophecy of the Reformation period.
Okay, so it is a specific judgment.
Yes. The vial is poured on the throne of the beast. In Edwards' theological framework, the beast represents the anti-Christian system of authority, specifically the papal power of Rome, which had persecuted the true church.
And pouring the vial on the throne means God is striking directly at the authority, the administration, and the dominion of that system.
It greatly weakens and diminishes that dominion. But the crucial phrase Edwards highlights is the result. The text says the beast's kingdom becomes full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain.
Here's where it gets really interesting, full of darkness. I want to ask you to clarify what darkness means here in this specific prophetic context, because he obviously isn't talking about a literal eclipse or the sun burning out over Europe.
No, not a literal darkness.
We have to separate it from literal darkness and connect it to political and intellectual failure, correct?
Spot on. Darkness here signifies a total failure of policy, subtlety, and wisdom. The opposition has historically relied on their deep understanding and craftiness to prevail.
They were smart.
Very smart. The book of Daniel describes a king of fierce countenance understanding dark sentences, causing craft to prosper through his policy. This worldly understanding, this shrewd political calculation, is the light of the anti-Christian kingdom.
So when the prophecy says their kingdom becomes full of darkness, it means their policy fails them completely.
Their authority is weakened, and all their subtlety, all their backroom deals, cannot avail them to support their throne or recover what they have lost.
It's not that God removes their weapons. It's like God introduces a permanent, frustrating lag into their video game.
That is a great way to put it.
They still have all the firepower, they still have the strategy, they still have the malice, but every time they pull the trigger, the target has already moved. They grope in the dark.
They stumble and are confounded in their purposes, plots, and enterprises. Their deep-laid schemes continually frustrate them. Their darkness is a terrifying lack of situational awareness.
That lag metaphor really captures what Edwards is saying, and he provides several brilliant scriptural parallels to illustrate how God uses this specific kind of darkness to defend his people.
He compares it to the mystical Egyptians. Think of the Exodus narrative.
Right, the parting of the Red Sea.
The Egyptians are pursuing the Israelites. They have them pinned against the Red Sea. They have chariots. They have the military advantage. And what does God do? He defends his people by placing a pillar of cloud and thick darkness between the two camps.
The Egyptians have all the malice and all the weapons, but they cannot see how to apply them. They're completely neutralized by darkness.
He also compares it to the men of Sodom at Lot's door. The angels were inside Lot's house, and the men of Sodom were rioting outside, striking the door, violently trying to break in.
And God didn't strike them dead immediately. He smote them with blindness.
The text says they wearied themselves trying to find the door. Their malicious intent was completely thwarted by a sudden, confounding inability to perceive reality. They exhausted themselves groping a flat wall.
The third parallel is perhaps the most vivid. It is the story of the Syrian army surrounding the prophet Elisha in the city of Dothan.
Elisha is the prophet, the true witness of the Lord. The Syrian king is furious with him, so he sends horses, chariots, and a great host to surround the city by night to apprehend him.
Elisha's servant wakes up, sees the massive army, and absolutely panics.
But Elisha prays, and God strikes the entire Syrian army with blindness. Elisha literally walks out to the commanders of the army sent to kill him, tells them they're in the wrong city, and leads them away to Samaria.
They are completely unable to execute their massive military advantage because they are struck with a bewildering darkness.
Edwards quotes the book of Job, saying God disappoints the devices of the crafty, taking the wise in their own craftiness. So they meet with darkness in the daytime and grope in the noonday as in the night.
This wasn't just abstract theology for Edwards. He applies this biblical pattern to the real-world history of the 200 years preceding his writing.
He looks back at the countless crafty attempts by the opposing powers to subjugate the Protestant nations, what they call the Northern Heresy.
He notes that they have wearied themselves in these endeavors. They have exerted their utmost policy, spent vast fortunes, and deployed brilliant political maneuvering, but they have been continually disappointed and strangely confounded.
Think about the Spanish Armada in 1588. King Philip of Spain assembled an invincible fleet, a massive, highly resourced attempt to invade England, overthrow the Protestant Queen Elizabeth, and wipe out the Reformation there.
They had the numbers, the ships, the veterans.
But what happened? The English used fire ships to break their formation, and then a massive, unseasonable storm, what the English called the Protestant wind, blew the Armada completely off course, wrecking it against the coasts of Scotland and Ireland.
The massive plot collapsed due to elements completely outside their control.
Or the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. Guy Fawkes and a group of conspirators literally placed 36 barrels of gunpowder under the House of Lords in London.
The plan was to blow up the king and the entire Protestant leadership in one single devastating moment.
It was sophisticated, it was secret, and it was brought to the very brink of success.
But what happened? An anonymous letter was sent to a lord at the final hour, the cellars were searched, and the plot was dismantled just before the match was lit.
Edwards observes that when their matters seemed brought to a degree of ripeness, when they triumphed in their minds as though the point was gained, their joy suddenly turned into vexation and torment.
The barrels are discovered, the wind shifts.
This constant, frustrating failure of their best-laid plans causes the opposition to, in the words of the psalm, gnash their teeth and melt away. Their desire perishes.
Edwards concludes that since God has so remarkably fulfilled his word in defending his church by confounding the enemy's policy with this bewildering darkness, we have ground to trust that he will defend it to the end.
The opposition retains its hatred, but it loses its competence. The light of their wicked wisdom is extinguished, leaving them to thrash about in the dark.
That brings a massive sense of security to the believer. You don't have to live in terror of the enemy's master plan if God has promised to strike their planners with persistent, frustrating blindness.
They might try to build the trap, but God will ensure they forget how the spring works.
Which brings us to Edwards' final and perhaps most devastating argument. For the final major argument, he does not just rely on history or logic. He goes straight to the structure of the book of Revelation to prove a textual inconsistency.
He essentially says, look, if you hold the view that Revelation 11 is a future event, you break the internal logic of the entire book.
I want to frame this with an analogy for you. Imagine reading a detailed history book about a great war. In chapter 11 of this book, the author describes a terrible, devastating battle. The author explicitly calls this battle the definitive, absolute, final end of the war.
Right.
But in this battle, your side loses completely. Everyone is killed, the enemy wins, the book says it is over.
Total defeat.
Then you turn to chapter 19 of the same book, and the author describes another completely different battle, and he also calls this the definitive, absolute, final end of the war.
But in this one, your side wins a glorious, overwhelming victory. The enemy is crushed.
The book would make no sense. Explain this clash between Revelation 11 and Revelation 16 and 19. You cannot have two completely different battles with opposite outcomes, both acting as the final end of the same war.
Edwards is pointing out that those who suppose the slaying of the witnesses is yet to be fulfilled are making the prophecies of Revelation entirely inconsistent with one another. So let's look at the textual breakdown.
Let's do it.
According to the fearful hypothesis of his day, the battle in Revelation 11, where the beast makes war with the witnesses, overcomes them, and kills them, is the last and greatest conflict before the utter overthrow of the anti-Christian kingdom.
They assume that immediately after the church lies dead in the streets, she will miraculously rise and enter her latter-day glory.
But, as Edwards points out, that means the conflict in chapter 11 must be the exact same event as the great battle described later in chapters 16 and 19.
Because the battle in chapter 19 is indisputably described as the final conflict before the church's advancement to glory.
Right. If they are both the immediate precursor to the latter-day glory, they must be describing the same event. They occupy the exact same slot on the prophetic timeline.
And here is where Edwards proves they cannot possibly be the same battle. Because the descriptions, the tone, and the issues of the two conflicts are completely diametrically opposed.
In the battle of chapter 11, the church fights in sorrow, wearing sackcloth and shedding blood.
But in the battles of chapter 16 and 19, the church is not in sackcloth.
Not at all. The church goes forth to fight clothed in white raiment, following Christ himself, who is depicted on a white horse wearing many crowns.
The saints follow him on white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. This is the raiment of strength, joy, glory, and absolute triumph. It is the exact opposite of the mourning and weakness of sackcloth.
The contrasts just keep piling up. In chapter 11, the outcome of the battle is that the beast overcomes the witnesses and kills them.
The book of Daniel, talking about the same system, says the horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them.
But in chapter 19, the outcome is exactly the reverse. The church overcomes the beast and kills the enemies. Revelation 17 says they shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them.
The treatment of the bodies is another stark contrast Edwards highlights. Let's look at that.
In the conflict of chapter 11, the beast kills the witnesses, and their dead bodies lie unburied in the streets of the great city. Their enemies rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, treating the dead saints with extreme contempt.
But in the last battle of chapter 19, Christ and his church slay their enemies, and it is the enemies' dead bodies that are left unburied.
The text says they are given to be meat for the fowls of heaven. The beast and the false prophet are taken and cast alive into the lake of fire.
So you have two entirely different outcomes. In one, the saints are dead, unburied, and mocked while the world throws a party.
In the other, the enemies are dead, unburied, and devoured by birds, while the beast is thrown into the fire.
The descriptions in chapters 16 and 19 leave absolutely no room for the enemies of the church to gain any advantage whatsoever.
There is no moment in that final battle where the church is vanquished, lying dead, with the world making sport of them. When the mighty host gathers at Armageddon in chapter 16, the very first thing we hear is the pouring out of the seventh vial and a loud voice out of the temple of heaven saying, "It is done."
The utter defeat of the church is mutually exclusive with its triumphant, white-robed victory.
This raises an important question. How can both be the final event before the latter-day glory? They cannot. If chapter 19 is the ultimate victory, chapter 11 cannot be a future event that immediately precedes the end.
Edwards' conclusion from this textual analysis is just undeniable.
The two accounts cannot be reconciled as the same event. Therefore, the general and terrible destruction of the church described in chapter 11 must be an event in the past.
It is a historical reality concerning the extremely dark times before the Reformation, not a looming future catastrophe waiting to ambush the modern church.
Which means the dreaded slaying of the witnesses is firmly in the rearview mirror.
The church has already survived its lowest, darkest point. God dropped the lifeline. He began the rescue. He blinded the political maneuvering of the enemy. The timeline is moving forward toward victory, not backward toward extinction.
Let's synthesize all these threads. Edwards systematically removes the dread of a coming global church extinction.
He uses historical realism, showing that the global spread of truth prevents a total relapse into the Dark Ages.
He demonstrates the constant pattern of God's deliverance, proving that God sustains and finishes the rescues he starts.
He points to the shifting demographics, showing that a massive global church cannot be symbolized by two witnesses.
He highlights the blinding of enemy policy, explaining how God frustrates their craftiness with video game-like lag and situational blindness.
And finally, he uses basic scriptural consistency to prove that the final battle is one of victory in white linen, not defeat in sackcloth.
However, we must provide the balanced caveat that Edwards includes at the end of his text.
Right, he doesn't promise a utopia.
No, he is very careful to state that this interpretation does not promise a completely frictionless future. He acknowledges that there is abundant evidence in Scripture that a mighty conflict still remains.
There will be violent struggles of Satan and his adherents in opposition to true religion.
He anticipates general commotions in the world, and he explicitly says that particular Christians may suffer hard things in this conflict. The removal of the fear of total extinction does not mean the removal of all hardship or local persecution.
But the grand conclusion is that, in the general sense, Satan and the anti-Christian systems shall not get the victory.
They will not greatly prevail.
Mm-hmm.
On the contrary, they shall be entirely conquered and utterly overthrown in the great battle.
And that is the massive theological shift. The war might still have fierce skirmishes, and individual soldiers might face terrible trials, but the existential threat to the survival of the army is gone. The final outcome is assured, and the trajectory is upward.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
Yeah, I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought. If Edwards is right, and the absolute darkest days of spiritual ignorance are permanently behind us, how does that change the way you view the current cultural struggles around you?
It changes everything.
When you look at the news or the shifting societal norms, it is easy to adopt that bunker mentality, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But if you no longer have to fear an inevitable prophetic collapse of the church, if God's pattern is to persistently frustrate the darkness and advance the light, what bold prayers should you be praying today?
Instead of praying hesitant prayers of preservation, perhaps we should be praying audacious prayers for the advancement of Christ's kingdom.
Fully expecting that the best days of the church are not buried in the past, but are waiting for us in the future. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.